Hello, I'm Beverly Childs, Executive Director of the Anderson County Museum, and with me today is Dustin Norris, our curator. Since 2003, the Anderson County Museum Advisory Committee has been inducting people from Anderson County into our Hall of Fame. These are people that have made significant contributions to our county and the state of South Carolina. In 2017, we inducted Mr. Mark Hughee Gassaway, who was best known for not only his civil rights work, but his work in the African American community here in Anderson. At that induction ceremony, his great-grandson, Charles Kellogg, talked about his grandfather and all the work that he had done.
We were honored to get to work with Mr. Kellogg on this project. He works today as an academic advisor at the College of Lake County in Illinois. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Wisconsin-Parkside and a master's in education from Dominican University. As an amateur historian and genealogist, he gets to work today with his youngest daughter and now colleague, Khadijah Kellogg, to uncover their family history and put it in a global perspective.
We hope you enjoy our video on Mark Hughee Gassaway.
Mark Hughee Gassaway embodied many roles in Anderson County history, from father and teacher to spiritual leader and civil rights activist. He was born to Louisa McPhail and Larkin Gassaway Sr. near Honey Path, South Carolina, on August 10, 1852. Louisa had been taught by her father to read and write and was determined that all of her children should be educated. I feel sure she knew the importance that education would come to mean for the life of all of her children and their many descendants. Mark Gassaway excelled as a student and graduated in 1882 from Claflin College in Orangeburg, South Carolina. This made him the first African American in Anderson County to earn a college degree. From that point forward, he was referred to as Professor Mark Gassaway. While at Claflin, he was a classmate of William Buckley, who went on to be the fourth African American to receive a Ph.D. and a founding member of the NAACP. In 1889, Mark Gassaway went on to marry fellow educator Carrie P. Walls. Carrie graduated at the top of her class at Spelman Seminary in Atlanta, Georgia. Carrie was a student during the transition of Atlanta's Baptist Female Seminary to its renaming as Spelman's. The couple fostered a passion for educating black youth during a time when quality schooling was often unavailable to the African American community. They taught various courses in traditional subjects like reading, math, and geography, but they also offered vocational training and arts courses. Mark and Carrie started and raised their family in Anderson County. All of their children started their education in Anderson County, returning to help teach when they were able. One son went on to be an assistant state's attorney in Chicago, Illinois, after being one of the first African Americans to receive his law degree from University of Chicago. Another son, also a lawyer, became one of the first African American councilmen in Cleveland, Ohio. The family had established a strong educational legacy in their hometown, but in spite of this, the Gassaways would be forced to leave the county in 1919. In 1889, the same year of his marriage, Mark Gassaway was appointed the prestigious position of postmaster. The position of postmaster was in most cases an appointment by leading people of the community. The fact that Mark was appointed as postmaster does speak to the respect that was garnered by him. Unfortunately, all of the citizens were not ready for this progressive moment. It was published in one of the local newspapers that Mark would face stiff consequences if he did not relinquish his position immediately. Mark decided that it would be best not to accept the appointment and to continue his educational work in the county. It was at this time that Gassaway took over as principal at the Greeley Institute in Anderson. The school was located on the northeast corner of McDuffie and Greeley Streets. The teaching legacy of Mark and Carrie Gassaway began here. The school had been named for abolitionist Horace Greeley and was aimed toward the advancement and education of freedmen and their children. In 1913, the school would be relocated to the current location of Greeley Park on Fant Street. While presiding over Greeley Institute, Mark and Carrie Gassaway began boarding students, many traveling long distances to learn there. Their two-story home on Hampton Street could host more than a dozen students. From the Greeley Institute, Mark moved to his most famous appointment as principal of Reed Street Grammar School No. 4 around 1901. From the 1880s through 1919, Mark advanced Anderson County's African American community by educating thousands of the county's African American children. With Reed Street School as a base of operations, Gassaway was able to organize events and programs to benefit the African American community while simultaneously educating. For instance, he was able to partner with influential community members to help black soldiers restart their lives after returning from World War I. He also served as a delegate to the National Methodist Episcopal Conference for many years. Mark and Carrie took their work seriously and pushed the county's black youth to prepare themselves for life in the 20th century South. Carrie was able to bring other teachers from Spelman Seminary as the years passed and the school grew. Her connection to classmates from Spelman enabled news to be brought back from Africa and relayed to her students in Anderson to help create a global perspective. Professor Gassaway and his staff provided both traditional education and job training in the trades. One example can be found in the school's involvement in growing corn for broom making, a trade that Gassaway carried with him throughout his life. In this article, Professor Gassaway shares his knowledge of different types of corn and how they can best be utilized for broom production. In 1909, the most recognized and respected black man in the United States visited Anderson County. Booker T. Washington stopped in Anderson to give a speech and assess the state of African American education as a part of his well-publicized tour of southern states. Dr. Washington's speeches were designed to encourage blacks to do their best to progress and encourage whites not to block that progression. The route up from Charleston brought Washington through Newberry, Greenwood, Honey Path, Belton, and Williamston before arriving in Anderson and moving on to Greenville. Later in the day, Dr. Washington was served lunch at Reed School, where Professor Gassaway was principal. Historian David H. Jackson wrote, "When Washington's entourage finally reached Anderson, they were escorted to the amphitheater of the Buena Vista Park without delay. M. H. Gassaway, principal of the local graded school, presided over the meeting. Following a prayer by the Reverend W. H. Frazier and welcomed by banker J. J. Fretwell, Washington spoke to a mixed crowd of 3,000 people. Jackson went on to state, Washington and special guests were honored at the elegant home of the city's only black physician, Dr. L. A. Earl. While it's not known for sure, it is quite possible that Gassaway met Dr. Washington at the Atlanta Cotton States and International Expo of 1895. Gassaway was part of an organizing committee from Anderson County that attended the expo. It may also be at the expo that Gassaway met Dr. W. E. B. Du Bois, a relationship that would play an important part in Mark's life. Professor Gassaway would go on to become the first president of Anderson's NAACP chapter, which he established in 1919. However, his work with the organization drew the attention of local white supremacists who opposed the group. Escalation led to harassment, intimidation, and death threats against Gassaway, who, although having support of many influential members of the community, could not fend off the less educated citizens that were intimidated by the success of Professor Gassaway and his family. Once hailed for his achievements in the community, Mark was forced to pack up and move his family to Cleveland, Ohio. Some of his nieces and nephews also made the decision to leave at that time. After the death of Dr. Washington in 1915, his chief rival, Dr. W. E. B. Du Bois, became the voice of the African American people. Professor Gassaway had certainly embraced Dr. Washington's path for African American advancement in the early years, just as Dr. Du Bois did. As time passed, Professor Gassaway followed the lead of Dr. Du Bois in realizing that a more proactive approach to the advancement of African Americans was needed. This realization allowed Professor Gassaway to embrace the NAACP and their notion that African Americans could no longer use the Atlanta Compromise of Booker T. Washington as their guiding principle. Professor Gassaway was able to take the experience of being pushed out of Belden and Anderson and use it to embolden activism around the country. His hardships and hard work also resulted in a beautiful legacy of black education in Anderson for years to come. After leaving Anderson, Professor Gassaway immediately began taking his story of expulsion from Anderson to a national stage. Gassaway went on speaking dates with Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, where he was able to bring his story of the Red Summer to light. Gassaway's story was also published in Du Bois' Crises magazine, one of the leading black periodicals of the time. Ironically, in 1920, directly after the expulsion of the Gassaway family, Reed Street School underwent a reconstruction with funds partially provided by the Rosenwald Initiative, and other funds were raised from community members, local businesses, churches, and other public entities. Upon the completion of this reconstruction, Reed Street School would continue to mold young minds for the future. Graduates from the school would number in the thousands over the course of its history. Class sizes rose from the single digits in the early days to dozens in some cases. This photo features a home economics class of 30 girls, taught by Carrie Walls Gassaway to the far left. Total enrollment at the school reached over 1,000. In subsequent years, Reed Street School became large enough to host its own sports teams, which competed against other African American schools in the region. Today, this marker is the only physical remnant at the location of the Reed Street School. Its alumni have Mark and Carrie Gassaway to thank for their foundational work in black education. Their approximately 40 years of service to Anderson County was hailed in the day by local and national leaders and citizens alike. Unfortunately, Mark and his wife Carrie and several nieces and nephews had to leave their homes to migrate to Cleveland, Ohio. The educational path that Mark and Carrie carved out can still be felt in Anderson County over a century later. Mark and Carrie lived out their lives in Ohio, where the former principal continued as a delegate to the National Methodist Conferences and as a civil rights activist. Mark Gassaway was 67 years old when he left Anderson, and yet a few short years after moving to Cleveland, when he was 70, he started a broom company, Gassaway Brooms. The company prospered and helped provide a living for he and Carrie until each had passed on. Even after his death, the factory was updated and continued to run under the leadership of his sons, Harold and Charles, well into the 1950s. I'd like to thank my cousins Cynthia Garrison and Janice Gassaway for their research assistance and inspirational help in our family projects.
Thank you all so much for joining us today.
We hope you enjoyed our video on Mark Hughee Gassaway, and we hope you'll check out our website at andersoncountymuseum.org.